Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is presented by Sports Turf Managers Association. Leading up to STMA's annual conference, we will be hosting various webinars that preview conference education sessions. Our featured speaker today is Dr. Alec Kowaleski, Associate Professor at Oregon State University. He will be presenting a preview of his conference education session, Coast to Coast Integrated Weed Management for Cool Season Turfgrass. Attendees will be muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature. Please type in your question and Dr. Kowaleski will answer them during the presentation. Thank you for joining us today. You can go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. Yeah, so let's move over to this presentation I have prepared. And we're gonna make that real big there. We're gonna turn on the pointer option. There it is. All right. So where is everybody from in attendance today? Let's type in your chat and hear where everybody is coming from. So I live in Corvallis, Oregon. I'm joining you from my office in my home here that I started during COVID. Sumner, Washington. Gwen Stanky, look at that. Delaware. Don, okay. Alex from Sacramento, California. Who else we got out there? Kevin from Hudson, Massachusetts. Anybody else? I see 11 participants. Okay, so we got some people from Cool Season Climates. Abby from Denver. Excellent. I believe that's is that the president of the STMA, Abby? Richard from Colorado also. Okay, cool. So Josh from Denver. We got a strong Colorado group here. That's great because we're going to be talking about cool season turfgrass. So this is coast to coast integrated weed management for cool season turf. Today you're hearing from me, Alec Kowaleski, but other people that are going to be joining me for the presentation in Savannah, Georgia are going to include Emily Braithwaite, Matt Elmore, and Brandon McNally. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the upcoming STMA meeting. So our presentation, myself, Emily, Matt, and Brandon will be speaking to you on Thursday, January 20th from 8 to 10 a.m. And our presentation fits into the environmental and pest management, the EPM category there. Okay, so we'll be focusing on integrated pest management there in Savannah, which is a beautiful place if you've never been there before. I had lived for 3 years in Tifton, Georgia, while I worked at the Abraham Baldwin Agricultural College and visited Savannah a few times. And it's a great place to take a vacation and attend a conference. So I look forward to seeing you all there at Savannah, Georgia there. Okay, so again, this is cool season management, coast to coast integrated weed management for cool season turfgrass. We've got two parts of the presentation. There'll be a section based on West Coast integrated weed management, and then a section based on East Coast integrated weed management. So again, if you're a person managing cool season turfgrass, this is one of the presentations for you. Okay, the West Coast presentation will be made by people from Oregon State University, while the East Coast presentation will be made by people from New Jersey, which I believe is that right in there. Okay, from the New Jersey area there, right by the transition zone. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about what each of these presentations will be focused on. And we'll talk first about the West Coast integrated weed management for turfgrass portion, the first half of the presentation, which will be done by myself and Emily Braithwaite. So Emily and I both work for Oregon State University. I'm the turfgrass specialist there. I've been at Oregon State for 7 years now, going on 8 years, and I also worked at Abraham Baldwin Agricultural College in Georgia, as well as the Coastal Plains Experiment Station with the University of Georgia. And before that, I was a grad student at Michigan State. And Emily is a graduate of the turf program at Rutgers and has moved to OSU, Oregon, and has been with Oregon State now for 4 or 5 years, quite a few years now. And Emily is a research technician, holding a lot of weight, carrying a lot of responsibility in our program. Okay, so let's talk about some of the things that I'll be covering first, and then we'll talk about what Emily will be presenting. Okay, so my portion of the presentation will focus on the effects of cultural practices on annual bluegrass populations. And I'll be looking into research on tall fescue and perennial ryegrass, looking at different mowing heights and how it affects annual bluegrass in tall fescue, and then nitrogen rates and how that affects annual bluegrass in perennial ryegrass, and not just annual bluegrass for the nitrogen rate study, but also broadleaf weed populations and encroachment of other grasses such as creeping bentgrass, crabgrass, all kinds of different weeds, and how nitrogen rates affect that in perennial ryegrass. Then I'll also be talking about irrigation rates on tall fescue and how changing your irrigation rates can be used to control weeds, annual bluegrass, and other weeds as well. Okay. And the funding source, the thing that's been driving this research initiative, is this grant here, Resist POA. It's a USDA SCRI grant on annual bluegrass, particularly herbicide resistant annual bluegrass. And what we're trying to do is provide other ways to manage annual bluegrass, keep annual bluegrass out of desired turf than just herbicides, to reduce down herbicide use and prevent herbicide resistant annual bluegrass from developing and spreading. Okay, so that'll be the first part of my presentation. I will then move into low impact herbicides. So in the state of Oregon, we have a school IPM law, which has a variety of different restrictions for pest management on school grounds. And one of those is that you have to use low impact pesticides. So what I'll be focusing on is how a pesticide gets on the low impact list. I'll be focusing in on herbicides that have made it onto our low impact list, and then using these herbicides. In my presentation here, we'll also talk about, managing weeds in hardscapes, mulched areas, and turf grass. Because I know people that are taking care of schools are not just taking care of athletic fields, they're taking care of the general grounds, which include the lawn areas, the paths, the sidewalks, the parking lots, the mulch areas around buildings. So I know that is all part of your responsibility. So what herbicides can you use that are low impact on these different spaces here? Okay, so we'll be talking about that as well. Is there any questions regarding the two topics I'll be presenting on? So no questions. We'll keep pushing on here. Okay, so then again, our next speaker will be Emily Braithwaite, research technician at Oregon State University. And what Emily's going to be talking about, and again, this is your West Coast IPM management. Again, we're focused on cool season turfgrass management here. Emily will be talking about the effects of primary cultural practices on broadleaf weed populations. So not as much emphasis on annual bluegrass, but looking at broadleaf weeds now, how mowing height and frequency, nitrogen rate and frequency, and irrigation rate will affect broadleaf weed populations. And again, this is focused towards school IPM. So it's on the lower end of management here, not necessarily a sports field, but a more municipal type area. How can you reduce down your inputs, but also keep weeds out of there? Okay, so that will be the first part of Emily's research, and in that research is, again, part of the school IPM program, but I should also say funded by the school IPM program. Okay. The next part that Emily will be presenting is looking at different mulching material and seeding dates for optimum establishment of turfgrass and reducing weed populations. And in terms of turfgrass species, this research will focus on fine fescue establishment. Okay. And this is part of the low input turf project. Again, a USDA SCRI multi-state grant. The primary, how do I say that? The lead author of this grant is from the University of Minnesota, and we're kind of wrapping up this study. It's been done for several years now. I should say we've been working on it for several years, and it's almost done now. But what Emily will be talking about is how these different mulching materials affected germination and establishment of fine fescue, with the intention of having a nice, dense fine fescue stand that is then resistant to weed encroachment. And what's the best seeding date to establish your fine fescue? She'll have information on seeding in the state of Oregon, as well as information on seeding in the states of Minnesota and Indiana as well. So it'll be more than just West Coast here. She'll be giving some information on establishment in the Midwestern United States as well. Okay, so that kind of wraps up what the West Coast team from Oregon State University will be presenting. And to quickly summarize that, we'll be talking about primary cultural practices, mowing, fertilization, irrigation, and herbicide use pertaining to tall fescue, fine fescue, and then just a little bit of perennial ryegrass. So people managing fescues and ryegrass will benefit from that first half of the presentation. Okay. And then in the second part, should I see if there's any questions from people about West Coast management, Western half of the United States? No, it's a lively bunch here. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the East Coast integrated weed management for turfgrass. And our speakers here will be Matt Elmore and Brandon McNally. Okay. So our two speakers again are Dr. Elmore and Brandon McNally. Dr. Elmore is an extension specialist at the University of Rutgers with a lot of focus on weed management. Okay, so Dr. Elmore will be providing his weed management extension specialist skills in his presentation, and then you'll also be hearing from Brandon McNally, Matt's graduate student. Brandon is just completing his master's degree, and I spoke to Matt yesterday about this. Brandon is going to be moving to Purdue to finish or start a PhD again in turfgrass management, working with Dr. Patton. So we've got Brandon McNally and Matt Elmore, the two speakers from the University of Rutgers, or actually, I believe it's the Rutgers University, excuse me. Okay, so let's talk about the individual or topics that Matt will be presenting first, and then we'll talk about what Brandon will be discussing. So Matt Elmore, Dr. Elmore will be working on integrated cultural strategies for weed control and cool season turf. I had a phone call with Matt about this yesterday, and some of the things Matt is excited to present to y'all include looking at the effects of cultivation and summer annuals. So how does cultivation timing affect annual encroachment? Weeds like goosegrass or annual bluegrass, how does cultivation timing interact with that? He'll be presenting work on herbicide-resistant annual bluegrass, which is the byproduct of this Resist POA USDA SCRI grant on annual bluegrass. So he'll be talking about some of the resistant annual bluegrass, herbicide-resistant annual bluegrass screening that he's done. He'll also be talking about herbicide-resistant goosegrass. Okay, so this is a big concern for stakeholders in the more eastern part of the world here, or in the United States. There's a lot of stakeholders in the New Jersey area concerned with goosegrass control and experiencing herbicide resistance. So Matt will be talking about that. And then Matt will also be talking about herbicide selection for broadleaf weeds, grassy weeds, and sedges, which I think is a very unique thing here about Matt's presentation, that focus on sedge control, specifically green kalinga, as it encroaches into turf grass. Okay, and Matt is very thankful for funding from the New Jersey Turf Association, USGA, and Environmental Institute for Golf, which has provided funds to research herbicide-resistant goosegrass and selective herbicides for these different weeds, including sedges. Okay, so that was a quick overview of Matt's presentation. And then finally, we'll have Brandon McNally, recently completed his master's degree, now starting a PhD for Purdue. Brandon will be talking about his research at the Rutgers University. Brandon will be talking about effects of primary cultural practices on annual bluegrass encroachment. So similar to what I'm talking about, again, looking at primary cultural practices and how it affects annual bluegrass encroachment and other weeds, but looking at some different grasses. I'm going to be talking about tall fescue primarily, while Brandon will be looking at perennial ryegrass for mowing height, Kentucky bluegrass for nitrogen rates, and then phosphorus rates rather than nitrogen rates for perennial ryegrass, and finally irrigation rates for perennial ryegrass. So you're going to have work collectively on perennial ryegrass, Kentucky bluegrass, tall fescue, fine fescue, looking at different mowing heights and frequencies, nitrogen rates, phosphorus rates, and irrigation rates. And then again, you'll have work from Emily on mulching and seeding dates, and Dr. Elmore looking at herbicide resistance for goosegrass, annual bluegrass, and herbicide selection for a variety of weeds, including sedges as well. Okay, so that kind of wraps up what I had prepared for today. Again, this presentation is coast to coast integrated weed management for cool season turf. You'll have two major parts of the presentation. You'll have a West Coast integrated weed management presentation coming from Corvallis, Oregon State University. Myself and Emily Braithwaite. You'll also have a presentation coming from the east side of the country, from Rutgers there in New Jersey. Dr. Elmore and Brandon McNally being your speakers, coming from the eastern part of the US there. Okay, and again, this will be on Thursday morning from 8 to 10 a.m., January 20th, and it fits into the Environmental and Pest Management EPM category for the STMA conference in Savannah, Georgia. Okay, that wraps everything up. If there are questions at this point, let's talk.
And just a reminder, if there are any questions, go ahead and enter them into the Q&A feature. You can also use the chat feature if that's easier for you guys. Doesn't look like there's any questions. You guys can always reach out to Alec by email if you have questions prior to the conference. But Alec, we want to thank you for joining us today, and I want to thank all of our attendees for joining us. This presentation will be featured at STMA's annual conference in Savannah, which is coming up in January. So make sure to come prepared with questions. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the week and a Merry Christmas.
Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you.
Happy holidays, everyone.